What's up, guys? Welcome to Roensch Capital Charts. Today we're taking a look at Palantir stock, ticker symbol PLTR, on a variety of time frames in anticipation of the next trading day, Wednesday, May 1st. Alright guys, Palantir stock here today, down 86 cents per share. It's minus 3.77%. It's down another, 9 cents or so in the after hours. Take it with a grain of salt. Volume is going to be extremely low in the after hours, so take that with a grain of salt. Let's take a look here. We'll do a quick little analysis of the volume profile to pull out some bias that isn't obvious simply by looking at the price action, because that's done. We already know what happened. And then we'll take a look at the psychological levels that we need to be paying attention to, and traders as well will be paying attention to them. And we'll finish out here with the expected move and the directional bias coming out of the chain. So let's start here with just a quick analysis of the volume profile on the 5-minute chart. Listen guys, by the way, Palantir is a daily upload, so if you are new here, I appreciate you subscribing to the channel, and I will keep the Palantir videos coming. Now, since the movement here on Palantir was really kind of grindy to the downside, I'm just going to look at the entirety of the volume profile, maybe with a little bit of an emphasis on like this accelerated downside push that we got intraday, and then the flattening out slight little bounce. The point of doing this, by the way, in case you are new here, is to pull out some bias that we can't get just by looking at the price action, right? So it's like taking a look under the hood and getting deeper, more detailed data of, hey, did the volume actually support that move, or did it move downside on a very neutral volume profile, which you kind of want whatever supports your bias. Or in the case of the stock going against you on that particular day, you want whatever doesn't support the other side's bias, if that makes sense. So let's take a look here. Very contextual open. We get a couple of pops here in red volume on these red bars. However, they were both very wicky candles, which leads me to believe that these were kind of battle bars with a lot of both sides orders going through. So I'm going to go ahead and ignore those. As we move through here intraday, we kind of obviously get some pops on red bars, which leads me to believe that throughout this time frame here, probably the most aggressive downside movement of the day, we're seeing some slight bearish bias, with a little bit of an emphasis on that move that we discussed earlier, with being a little bit of bearish bias. But the truth is, guys, as the stock began to level out, we also had some out of context volume on the green side over here. Had this volume just tanked off and we had 3 little green bars in a row, that would be very obvious bearish bias. However, this move in particular, we had 1 candle, maybe 2 candles. The reality is the bulls kind of held their own as the stock flattened out from that particular move, which to me kind of cancels for the most part out any bias that we had during this aggressive downside move and flattening out in the stock. Bears, you know, obviously you guys would want as much volume as possible on these red bars and then as little as possible on the green bars, whereas bulls, you would kind of want, you know, because it's a little more unrealistic to get massive bullish bias on a downside move like that. So next best thing is to see just neutral bias on that net negative move, anything that doesn't support the bear's thesis, and that's kind of what we got. Okay, now as we move throughout the day here, you know, we had a few other downside pushes, a small downside push there. We saw increasing volume on that, and then volume tanks off on the green bar, small amount of bearish bias there. And then into the close, we did see on those last 2 bars not a whole lot of movement, right, all things considered. But the volume did pump with a little bit of bearish bias heading into the close. Understand that higher volume, like especially this bar here, on stocks like a Palantir, right? It's usually that first volume bar after the close that we see a lot of rebalancing going on from big money funds and institutions. Okay, but the volume heading into the close actually outshined that, which isn't all that common, which leads me again to believe that we did see some bearish bias heading into the close there. So just be aware of that. Let's move on now to the self-fulfilling prophecy psychological levels that I think everyone's kind of paying attention to. Therefore, we need to take a look at heading into tomorrow. So if you guys remember yesterday, we had held the 50-period moving average here on the 30-minute. We gave that up off the open today, kind of tried to reclaim it off the open and eventually faded hard off of that. The 200 period actually held into the close. We gave it up in the after hours. However, after hours movement, again, take it with a grain of salt, the volume is very low. Okay, so for me, when you have downside breaks or upside breaks of a level like this in the after hours, I tend to hold off on declaring victory, in this case for the bears, until we see intraday volume come in and agree with that. So tomorrow, bears, you want to see a test of the 200 period on the 30-minute chart and a hard high volume rejection. Bulls, ideally, high volume break back upside through the 200 period, low volume retest, and then boom, claim it as support on a high volume bounce away. All right, let's move on here to the 4 hour and take a look. You can see that we're now pulling back in to that 50 period, that white line here on the 4 hour chart. Yeah, that's sitting, it's relatively close. It's at about 2163, 2164. Okay, so bulls, if we see a retest of that 50 period on the 4 hour now in particular, again, similar scenario, you want to see, I don't care because we're already above. I don't care what volume it retests it on, as long as we see more volume on the bounce back away. Okay, whereas bears, you want to see a high volume rip down through to get through that level, and then a low volume retracement back to test, and then a high volume confirmation on the rejection. That could set you bears up for a downside test, that 2130 in the near term. Okay, now the most important chart of all, guys, that's the daily. Let's take a look here. We have earnings coming up, however, not until May 6th. Okay, so that's next week. But if we take a look here on the daily, guys, yesterday we were talking, of course, about 23 and that 50-day moving average. It felt so in reach. Today we rejected off of 23, and we're now back about halfway in between that channel between 2130 and 23. So those are the two levels I'm watching, okay? You know, both bulls and bears, a test of 2130. Bulls, you want to see that hold. Bears, you want to see that rip downside through, get outside of that channel to the downside. 23, you know, bears, any retest of that, you want to see that, of course, reject as hard as possible. Whereas bulls, getting up through 23 is a great thing to reclaim, but just be aware that that 50-day moving average kind of awaits in the shadows just above 23 as a potential resistance. Bulls' best case scenario is to get up through 23 and the 50-day moving average. That could set, you know, us bulls up for an upside test in the near term. You know, not necessarily same day, of course, but that could set us up for kind of a clear sky setup in the near term for a test up toward 25.50. Now, implied volatility. Okay, still sitting compared to the last couple of months in the high range. Okay, so just understand, if you're buying calls or puts right now, you are paying up for a little bit of inflated premium, a little bit of Vega pump in those contracts. That leaves you open to a slightly higher risk of IV crush if IV begins to fall back downside. So just be aware of that. Okay, now expected move on Palantir. The next expiration we have is May 3rd. That's this Friday. The expected move by Friday's closing price compared to today's closing price is plus or minus 99 cents per share. Okay, there's no earnings between now and Friday. Okay, earnings are May 6th. So we can realistically divide that number by 3. That gives us plus or minus 33 cents. But we have to add back 50% to that number, because that 33 cent number, right, that assumes a streak. 3 red days in a row or 3 green days in a row heading into the end of the week. So I like to add back in this market about 50%. That gives us a plus or minus volatility expectation of 50 cents per share here tomorrow, by tomorrow's close compared to today's closing price. And again, guys, if you're new here, the expected move by design, it doesn't price in directional bias. It's the volatility expectation, which is a very important piece of the puzzle, especially when trading options. It is huge. Do not overlook that. You not only need a directional bias, I think a lot of newer option traders especially overlook the fact that directional bias alone isn't good enough. We need to have an opinion on volatility to most effectively position ourselves to really give ourselves the best probability of making money if we're correct. Whereas if you're kind of ignoring the volatility side of things and you're like, well, I'm bullish, so I'll buy calls, you know, the obvious one is theta decay that you can fall victim to. But if you fall victim to IV crush, you can actually be directionally correct and still lose money if you're not directionally correct enough, if that makes sense. Now, last thing we can do here, guys, directional bias coming out of the options chain. Let's take a look. This is all from today, by the way. We had just under 163,000 contracts traded today. And in typical Palantir fashion, this has been the trend as of late. We have about 109,000 of those were calls and about 54,000 of those were puts. So a heavy call side bias on the overall call put ratio here today on Palantir. But if we break this down by time frame, volume's a little bit lower, so take this with a grain of salt. But the 0 to 20 delta range, those short-term speculators, 22,500 calls and 14,400 puts. So a call side bias out of the short-term speculators as well. Hey, listen, if you guys are getting value out of these daily Palantir uploads, I ask you to do one thing. It takes half a second and it's 100% free. Please just leave a like on the video and then get out of here. Enjoy your day. I appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.